Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Oxford Martin School for what promises to be a very enjoyable and thought-provoking evening. My name is Cameron Hepburn. I'm Director of the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment, but I'm also a regular here, a principal investigator of a number of different programs here. And it's my pleasure, real pleasure tonight to introduce an old friend, Professor Simon Dietz, who has had a distinguished career already, despite actually still being relatively young in this area. He was just noting with him that he did his PhD at the LSE in 2006, and by 2008 was already running what is kind of arguably Europe, if not the world's leading institute in environmental economics outside of Oxford, known as the LSE Grantham Research Institute. So it was a very meteoric rise, quite justified, because he spent a year at the Treasury, which he tells me was enough to know that he didn't want to spend too much longer at the Treasury, but it happened to be the year when the Stern Review was put together, and Simon was absolutely instrumental in bringing the Stern Review to birth. And tonight's topic couldn't be more significant, really. We've just had the IPCC's 1.5 degree report, and one of the comments made about that report is that there could have been more economics in it. You might say that of almost everything, says the professor of environmental economics. But at a point in time when the most recent Nobel laureate in economics was partly awarded the prize for his work on climate change, still maintains that optimal warming is perhaps around 3.5 degrees. I think it's rather important that we have economists who can carefully and cogently think about the reasons, including costs and benefits, but also thinking through the option theory of whether we should be aiming for 1.5 degrees. So you've heard enough from me. I'm going to stop there and welcome Professor Simon Dietz to the stage for the evening's lecture. Thank you, Simon.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my sabbatical year, and I'm spending most of it in Oxford and having a great time, enjoying all my new colleagues, and I'm pleased to be here tonight for this lecture. This lecture very largely draws on a paper we published in the autumn of last year in the Annual Review of Environment and Resources, called The Economics of 1.5 Degrees Climate Change. And I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, my LSE colleagues, Alex Bowen and Baran Doda, AJ Gambier from Imperial College London, and Rachel Warren from the University of East Anglia. So perhaps we could just start by reflecting on how we got here. So in 1992, in Rio de Janeiro, at the so-called Earth Summit, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was agreed upon. The primary objective of which was to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent so-called dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. And that is still the overarching objective of climate policy that we're working under. But of course, dangerous anthropogenic interference was not defined precisely in 1992. And it took until 2009 at the much derided Copenhagen Climate Summit for it to get its first formal and precise definition as holding the increase in global temperature below 2 degrees Celsius. And this was formally incorporated in the UN process the following year in Cancun. And as you'll know, what happened in 2015 in Paris is that the overall objective of the UN climate process was the ambition was further increased, so that we are now aiming to hold the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, and pursue efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees. And now, without getting bogged down in the minutiae of how the negotiations went in Paris, essentially, 1.5 degrees was added to the overall objective of the UN process at the behest of the Pacific Island states and with the support of a coalition of high-emitting countries. And actually 1.5 degrees in 2015 had not been much studied as a climate objective. There hadn't been a lot of modelling of the impacts avoided by limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. There hadn't been much modelling of the costs of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. In some sense, it came from nowhere. So this triggered a flurry of research into the effects of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, culminating in the IPCC's special report on 1.5 degrees, which was published, or the first parts of which were published in the second half of last year. Now, from an economist's point of view, there's an obvious question to ask of the 1.5 degrees target. Will the benefits exceed the costs? More precisely, will it improve social welfare? And for an economist, this is a question that's self-evidently worth asking. I also think it's worth asking because, for various reasons, IPCC is not going to provide a clear answer to that question. IPCC had its fingers burnt on cost-benefit analysis a long time ago and has been reluctant to address the question particularly directly. So when we were asked last year by the Annual Review of Environment and Resources to write a paper on the economics of 1.5 degrees, we could see the value in doing so. So the main question I want to address tonight is this that you can see in front of you. But I also want to ask from an economist's point of view, what would 1.5 degrees policy look like? And of course, for that, we have to imagine at the moment, unfortunately. So let's start with the benefits of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. And what I want to do, first of all, is just try to get a sense of these in their natural units, if you like, without trying, first of all, to put an economic cost on them. Just look at what sort of benefits we might bring about by limiting warming to 1.5 degrees relative to 2 degrees. Well, this chart, which is from a paper published in 2016, sort of gives you a sense of some of the main benefits that we would get from limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. Reduced frequency of heat waves everywhere, reduced risk of droughts in some regions, notably the Mediterranean, a reduced frequency of heavy precipitation events everywhere, and in particular in South Asia, controlling the rate of sea level rise, limiting the destruction of coral reefs from total to near total, and reducing the negative effects on agricultural yields so that globally, at 1.5 degrees, they may even be greater than they are today. So this slide is illustrative of the sort of benefits we might achieve, but we should really try to extract some generalities, because if you read the literature on the physical impacts of climate change, it's rather hard to do that. There are many, and they're not immediately comparable. So in terms of extracting generalities, I want to make 3 points. The first one is that some of the greatest benefits of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees will be enjoyed by natural systems and biodiversity. This slide it draws on work that my co-author Rachel Warren published in Science last year, where they modelled the impacts of various degrees of warming on the incidence of insects, plants, vertebrates, and so on worldwide. And they found that the number of insect species projected to lose more than half their range is reduced by about 2/3 when limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. And the number of plant and animal species projected to lose more than half their range is reduced by about half. So the first key message is that some of the biggest benefits of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees will be in the natural world rather than in human systems. Secondly, some of the largest benefits of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees are going to be in poor countries. And one way of looking at this was put forward in a paper published last year by King and Harrington in Geophysical Research Letters, where they noted that the greatest changes in temperature relative to variability occur in the tropics, and the poorest people would experience the most perceptible climate change from 1.5 to 2 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels. Allied to this, we know from economic research into climate impacts that the cost of a given degree of global temperature rise is higher in poor countries than it is in rich countries, both because they are already hotter than is optimal for economic activity, and because being poor, they are more sensitive and less able to adapt. So one of the things we can say, at least on the benefits side, so on a gross basis, is that limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is likely to be progressive on a global level, pro-poor. And I must emphasize that that is an argument made only with respect to benefits at this point. The third key point is that limiting warming to 1.5 degrees likely reduces the risk of crossing certain key climate tipping points or thresholds, such as melting of the Greenland ice sheet. However, there is a great amount of uncertainty about the position of these thresholds, such as they do exist. So it is very difficult to be precise about how much we reduce the risk of crossing these tipping points. So those are the three general conclusions that I would draw from the physical impacts literature. Limiting warming to 1.5 degrees would be primarily beneficial for natural systems and for poor countries. And it would also likely reduce the risk of crossing key climate tipping points. What about the costs? Well, unlike the last section of my talk, what I'm going to present to you now is based mainly on economic models of the energy system. A good way to think about how much it would cost to limit warming to 1.5 degrees and how much more it would cost relative to 2 degrees is to think about the available carbon budget that is left while respecting either of these targets. Now, we can think about it this way because the response of global temperature to carbon dioxide emissions is roughly linear. So the more CO2 we put into the atmosphere, the more temperature increases. It also so happens that although there are other greenhouse gases, notably nitrous oxide and methane, which are emitted in large quantities by agricultural activities, energy models suggest that abatement of these other gases is roughly the same in 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees scenarios. So we can put those out of the equation and just focus on the difference in CO2 emissions. What you can see in front of you is data from the IPCC special report. On the right-hand side, in the orange box, the 2 degrees carbon budget. On the left-hand side, in the blue box, the 1.5 degrees carbon budget. The bottom of the box is a 2/3 chance of limiting warming to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. The white line is a 50-50 chance, and the top of the box is a 1/3 chance. Now, perhaps you would agree with me that a meaningful comparison is a 2/3 chance of 2 degrees versus a 2/3 chance of 1.5 degrees. And on that basis, what I'm trying to show you here is that the available carbon budget is 64% smaller, according to IPCC. So, a great deal smaller. And so, if we have a much smaller carbon budget remaining, then we'll have to reduce carbon emissions at a much greater rate, which is what I want to show you in this slide. So these results are from an important paper which was published in 2015 in Nature Climate Change by Yuri Rogelj and colleagues. The blue box is an estimate of the annual rate of reduction of energy-related CO2 emissions on 1.5 degrees compatible scenarios. The orange box, left of middle, is the corresponding required rate of reduction in likely 2 degrees scenarios. So scenarios that give you about a 2/3 chance of avoiding 2 degrees. And you can see that whereas to limit warming to 2 degrees, we would need to reduce energy-related CO2 emissions by about 1.75% a year. For 1.5 degrees, it might be as much as 2.25, 2.5, 2.75, maybe even 3% per year. Now, this is almost without parallel in recent industrial experience. To put it into context a little bit, in the period from 1970 to 2010 or so, 1974 to 2014 to be exact, Sweden reduced its greenhouse energy-related CO2 emissions by an average of 1.5% per year. So from about the onset of the oil shocks in the 70s through to 2014 when the data series ends. France, which embarked on a large-scale program of nuclear power, managed a reduction of, on average, 1.2% per year over the same period. The world, however, increased its energy-related CO2 emissions by nearly 2% per year. So the rate of reduction required is unparalleled. We haven't experienced it in any country over a sustained period of time. Perhaps the closest analogue is what happened to energy-related CO2 emissions behind the Iron Curtain at the end of the 1980s. And we should be cautious, naturally, in thinking about whether that's a situation that we want to bring about again. So, we need to reduce energy-related carbon dioxide emissions and other emissions at an unprecedented rate. What might it cost? Well, this is an analysis conducted by my colleague A.J. Gambier for our paper, collecting together estimates from a variety of energy systems models. And our headline estimate is that were we to be on a 1.5 degrees compatible pathway, we would have to have a price of carbon today of in excess of $100 a ton of CO2. And that would have to rise essentially exponentially over the course of the century. And it would, throughout the century, be about 3 times as high as the carbon price required to limit warming to 2 degrees. Now, it's worth just taking a deep breath and contemplating that result. Firstly, it indicates that limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is likely to be very costly. The second thing it indicates, when you think about the world as it is today, is how far we are from being on that pathway. These models are idealized visions of the global economy. This is a $100 a ton carbon price applying in all countries to all CO2 emissions. We're not anywhere close to being in that kind of situation at present, which shows you how far we've got to go. So I conclude this section by advancing the idea that limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is likely to be very costly. What we need to do now, of course, is compare the benefits and the costs. And now, for those of you who have some experience with the economics of climate change, you are probably expecting me now to do some integrated assessment modelling. Perhaps to use Bill Nordhaus's DICE model. But I'm not going to do that. I think I've used integrated assessment models a lot in my research. I think they can help to deliver lots of important academic insights. But I think when it comes to deriving policy conclusions, they're insufficiently reliable. If you're going to write a paper which is going to be read outside of your narrow community that understands the weaknesses and the strengths of these models, it's probably not a good idea to run an integrated assessment model and advance the central result from that model as being the conclusion of your study. So we're going to go about it a different way. And to do that, I'm going to draw on some recent work I've done with a colleague, Frank Venmans, who's at the University of Mons in Belgium. And what we've tried to do is produce a simple policy rule that people can use to consider what they think optimal peak warming of the planet should be. This is consistent with a number of papers that have been published in the last few years, which have tried to simplify integrated assessment models with a view to making them more transparent. It's not necessarily more reliable, but at least it's transparent. You could put your numbers in, whatever you think the values of these various parameters that I'll explain in a moment, into the formula and see what temperature you get out. So let me take a moment to break down this formula. What do we have? Well, the first thing we have, which some of you might recognize, is the discount rate, adjusted for the rate of economic growth. You might recognize the Ramsey rule for the discount rate in the brackets here, minus the growth rate of the economy. Why is this important for the economics of climate change? The discount rate governs the weight which we put on future generations in our present calculations. The higher is the discount rate, the less weight we put on the future, the less we care about climate change, and the more we allow the global temperature to rise. So it's natural that we see that on the numerator of this expression. However, growth does two things. Growth increases the discount rate because it makes the future richer, and that's the main reason for discounting. But growth also increases the undiscounted value of climate damages. So that's why we have the discount rate adjusted for growth. The phi parameter is the unit cost of the backstop carbon-free technology. So the technology we use to take the last ton of carbon out of the atmosphere. You could put various interpretations on this parameter, but perhaps the most obvious one is the marginal cost of carbon dioxide removal technologies. That also appears on the numerator because naturally the more expensive is the backstop, the less inclined you are to limit emissions, the higher is the optimal temperature that you allow. On the denominator are firstly the so-called transient climate response to cumulative carbon emissions, essentially how much the temperature goes up for a unit emission of carbon dioxide, and the so-called damage function coefficient, essentially telling you how much it costs when temperatures rise. And naturally these two things appear in the denominator. The more sensitive the climate is to emissions, the more damaging the temperature increases are, the more you want to limit warming. Now, having defined this concept, perhaps the first thing to say is that all of these parameters are fiercely debated within environmental economics. They're uncertain, which naturally means that T star, optimal peak warming, is an uncertain and contested quantity. Nonetheless, what I'm going to suggest is the following thought experiment. Let's treat all the parameters in this equation as being known for sure, except the damage function coefficient, which I would argue is the least well understood of these parameters. So let's plug in a preferred value for all of these parameters except gamma, the damage function coefficient. And let's then ask, how high would damages have to be in order for 1.5 degrees to be the optimal temperature? Essentially, what is the switching value of gamma? And when we perform this thought experiment, we get the following answer. If the damages from 3 degrees of warming, which is a common calibration point in the economics of climate change, are 9.8% of global GDP, so in other words, if 3 degrees of warming would reduce global output by about 10%, then limiting warming to 1.5 degrees would maximize the net benefits to society of climate action. So we can take that number, 9.8%, and compare it with the economic literature on climate damages and see where it lies. So what I'm showing you on the right-hand side of this slide is the results of a survey of the literature by Bill Nordhaus and Andrew Moffat, which was published in 2017 by the National Bureau of Economic Research. So they collected some 36 different estimates of the cost of climate change at different levels of warming and plotted them. And each of these dots or circles is an independent or quasi-independent estimate. The size of the circles represents Bill's subjective weighting on the importance of the study. Don't worry about that too much. The red dot is the switching value of gamma, 9.8% of global GDP at 3 degrees of warming. Sorry, I put it at 4, I should move it across. Now, the important thing to realize about the Nordhaus paper is that it was based mainly on older studies. And relative to the older studies, I think what you can probably see here is that 9.8% as an estimate is a bit of an outlier. Most of the estimates from the older studies suggest that 3 degrees of warming would give you a loss of GDP of about 3%. Worth doing something to avoid, but not catastrophic. Now, what's happened in the economics of climate change in recent years is that we've gathered a lot more evidence about what fluctuations in temperature and rainfall have done for the economy in the past half century or so. And the important feature of those estimates is they're much bigger. They give us a range of roughly 5 to more than 20% of GDP for 3 degrees of warming. This is lined up at 4, which is my mistake. I apologise. Just shove that over by half a degree. Now, these recent empirical studies are valuable because they're based on real empirical evidence, and not all of the 36 studies that Bill collected could really be described as empirical. On the other hand, even though there's quite a bandwagon has built up behind these new studies, it's important to realise that they also have their limitations. Most of all, that they try to exploit year-on-year fluctuations in temperature over the past in order to work out what will be the change in the long-run average temperature in the future. It's not an obvious correspondence. So I would argue it's not obvious that we throw out all of the 36 previous estimates in favour of these new studies, or vice versa. I think we have to keep them all at play. If you're with me on that, then you can see clearly that 9.8 degrees is within the range, which leads me to a simple and possibly somewhat disappointing conclusion from this exercise, but I think it is the only intellectually responsible conclusion to make. And that is that it cannot be ruled out or in that the 1.5 degrees target passes a cost-benefit test. And I want to say that if you don't find my thought experiment entirely convincing, there are a number of other ways in which you could reach essentially the same conclusion. They're just, I would say, a bit more complicated. So this is one of the key conclusions of our paper, which, as I say, may appear to you to be somewhat unsatisfying. But it's not the whole story. Because if we're uncertain about whether it passes a cost-benefit test today, we can turn this into a dynamic problem and ask the question, okay, maybe one day we will be certain whether it passes a cost-benefit test or not. But what should we do in the meantime? Should we wait until we find out and then act? Or should we act now and find out later? And on that, I think, and this relies less on formal analysis, I should add, and more on my professionally considered gut feeling, as Martin Weitzman would put it. I think that if we want to keep the option open for 1.5 degrees, we clearly have to aim for it now, because very quickly it will become infeasible to get there without recourse to geoengineering, about which I will speak in a moment. Because of the carbon budget logic, the longer you leave it, the more aggressively you have to reduce emissions once you finally get around to it. We know from the slide I showed you about 5-10 minutes ago that even if we start now, we have to reduce energy-related CO2 emissions by, say, 2.5% a year. If we leave it much longer, we'll be talking about 3, 4, 5%, and at that point we could start to consider it to be effectively infeasible. So if we want to talk about keeping our options open, then really we have to set off as if we're pursuing the 1.5 degrees target now. And if we find out later that the benefits are not as large as the costs, well, so be it. We can relax the constraint. But if we don't impose the constraint now, we'll never be able to get there. That is an argument which I believe at the level of intuition. It's not an argument which I've articulated formally. It's very difficult to model option values in this context. But I would be prepared to say that I think from the point of view of keeping options open, it's worth pursuing now. The second question that I wanted to ask in the lecture is, what does 1.5 degrees policy look like? And within that, I want to essentially ask the question, is 1.5 degrees policy just like a beefed up version of 2 degrees policy? Is it 2 degrees policy on steroids, if you like? Well, in order to try to get an intuition for this, I want to show you some more results from the energy modelling literature, because I think these are quite instructive. Again, this is analysis which my colleague AJ Gambier prepared. Basically, on the left-hand side of this slide are things we need to do more of if we're going to limit warming to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. On the right-hand side are things that we need to do less of. Basically, what these two charts are showing you is that what we need to do more of is carbon capture and storage, and within that, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and electrification. What we need to do less of is we need to self-evidently have fewer fossil fuels in the energy mix. We need to be more energy efficient. And, as is actually often overlooked in the policy discussions, in my opinion, we just need to demand less energy. We need less energy demand. And what these slides are particularly interesting for, I find, is looking at what do we need to do especially more of in a 1.5 degrees scenario than in a 2 degrees scenario. On the left-hand side, you can see that what we need especially more of is carbon capture and storage of CO2 emissions produced in power plants, and electrification of the transportation system, which in more moderate scenarios is often left till later because it's difficult. On the right-hand side, what we need significantly more of is reductions in final energy demand, particularly in the building sector. And for me, these results are important because they reinforce a standard conclusion that any economist will put forward when talking about what does a good climate policy look like. And that is, 1, put a price on carbon and at the same time eliminate perverse fossil fuel subsidies. Now, to a degree, you might think this is a banal conclusion. It's economics 101. It's what an economist will always tell you about climate change policy. But I think actually that it follows from the results I just showed you about the importance of reducing final energy demand, that we need policies that are effective in decentralizing the signal to a diffuse number of millions, billions of actors in the economy. Carbon prices also combat the rebound effect, incentivize innovation, and reduce revenue, which in well-designed policies can be used to address unfortunate distributive consequences. I would be very happy to comment in the Q&A session about things like the Gilets jaunes, if you like. My simple point about the Gilets jaunes, however, is that it is not in any case what an economist would recommend a carbon price look like. Now, the second important conclusion, which again is somewhat banal, is that we need to subsidize low carbon research and development and support the deployment of low carbon technologies. Again, that's, well, if not economics 101, it's at least economics 201 of climate change. There are multiple market failures, and ever since Tinbergen, we've known that we need multiple instruments to address multiple market failures. So that's not particularly interesting. What I do think within this broad set of conclusions is important is to look at carbon capture and storage in particular. Most energy models, if not all of them, suggest we need to do a lot of carbon capture and storage if we're going to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, even 2 degrees at an acceptable cost. We've done virtually nothing on carbon capture and storage. And it seems clear that a carbon price alone is not going to bring it forward. Such are the costs and the investment risks. Therefore, we should be open to more radical thinking about how to deliver carbon capture and storage, including, and I say this not without reservations, but including recent arguments about mandatory carbon capture and storage. I think it could be done in different ways, but I do think it follows logically from the modelling that this needs to be a large-scale, coordinated, essentially state-driven activity. I'm coming to the end now. I just want to close, first of all, with some remarks about geoengineering. What about it? Well, of course, we should break up geoengineering, as is now common, into two categories. We should think on the one hand about carbon dioxide removal technologies, which take CO2 out of the atmosphere and therefore address the root cause of the problem. And they range from good old-fashioned afforestation all the way through to plastic windmills, fertilization of the oceans, these kinds of things. And on the other hand, we have what have come to be known as solar radiation management technologies, essentially. trying to manipulate the energy balance of the Earth through, for instance, scattering the stratosphere with dust to reflect incoming sunlight. What about the economics of these two classes of geoengineering technology? Well, the thing about carbon dioxide removal is that it's expensive at scale. So in the paper, my colleague Barandora does a back-of-the-envelope calculation of what it would take to go from 2 degrees of warming to 1.5 degrees of warming through carbon dioxide removal alone. And already taking into account the fact that to get to 2 degrees, we probably have to do quite a lot of the less revolutionary CDR technologies like afforestation. His back-of-the-envelope calculation is that the present value cost of that would be about $13.5 trillion, as against global economic output of 75 trillion or so dollars. A lot. And of course, parenthetically, some of the more conventional carbon dioxide removal techniques, such as bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, potentially raise food security concerns due to the amount of land they might require. And there's some interesting research coming out on this now, trying to quantify the implications for food supply. What about solar radiation management? Well, the thing about solar radiation management, which has been known for a while, at least ever since Scott Barrett's marvellous article, The Incredible Economics of Geoengineering, is that it can be remarkably cheap and, of course, fast-acting. So Baran's back-of-the-envelope estimate is that it would cost only $600 billion to go from 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees of warming through solar radiation management alone. That's 95% cheaper than carbon dioxide removal. But of course, doing so poses untold environmental risks. And my take on this is that, to this point, society's revealed preference has been not to take that risk. We've never got close to doing solar radiation management. I think we should probably consider experimentation, but I think we should respect that outcome as being what society's revealed preference is for solar radiation management, and it is don't take that risk. So that brings me back to my conclusion that it may well be economically optimal to pursue a 1.5 degree strategy now in order to keep the option open. Because I don't think it would be a smart idea to rely on solar radiation management alone to achieve the wedge between 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees. Let me summarize. I want to make 6 points in summary. Firstly, as I said, there's no clear answer to the question of whether the 1.5 degrees target passes a cost-benefit test. And the qualitative logic is this. The costs are almost certainly high. Economists' estimate of the benefits range from tiny to enormous, and probably high. Therefore, we can't come to a clear conclusion. The benefits, though, seem to be particularly significant for natural systems and poorer regions. Limiting warming to 1.5 degrees also reduces the risks of crossing key thresholds, but in a way which cannot really be quantified. The remaining carbon budget for 1.5 degrees is very small, and in order to stay within it, we would have to decarbonize the global economy at an unprecedented rate, and that would entail large costs. Scenarios that limit warming to 1.5 degrees involve notably large reductions in energy demand and heavy reliance ultimately on negative emissions technologies such as bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Any further delay in pursuing a 1.5 degrees path likely renders that target unattainable by any other means than large-scale carbon dioxide removal, which is extremely expensive, or solar radiation management, which is extremely cheap but extremely risky. The case for carbon pricing as a central plank of mitigation policy, lastly, is, I think, stronger than ever, looking at what we need to do in the economy to reduce emissions, although this needs to be complemented by a mix of other policies, and there may be a place for more interventionist or state-driven policies alongside carbon pricing, particularly when it comes to bringing forward the necessary carbon capture and storage. So that's the end of my lecture. Thank you very much. Those were the economics of 1.5 degrees climate change. I'd be happy to take your questions.
It was, as expected, commendably clear, very informative as it was depressing. But we have time, we have 20 minutes for questions, so I'm going to see if there are hands going up, and there are. Great, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I've got 5. So let's start at the front and work backwards, please.
So for those of us that are not very aware of some of the topics you've been discussing, can you just tell us on putting dust into the atmosphere, what are those risks? I can imagine what they are, but I'd like to hear from you.
Great, thank you very much. Commendably short. Please also state your name before you ask your question. And one thing I should have said is that we are being filmed and livecast. I'm afraid it's too late for you, sir. But if you don't want to be filmed or livecast, then don't ask a question.
I'm John Hoffmeyer, by the way, from the Center for
Thank you, John. I hope you don't mind.
Business. I'm fine being recorded.
Great. So next is I'll collect 3 at a time.
Thank you. My name's...
It's on. It's working.
Okay. My name's Minnie Gray. So you promised to talk a bit about Gilets jaunes, and what I want... that seems to be, to me, what happens when you bring in carbon taxes that people seem to find unacceptable. So I wondered if you could speak a bit about ways to make carbon pricing more acceptable. For example, things like carbon fee and dividend. Tell us a bit what you think about those ideas.
Fantastic. 2 very good questions. I commend your questions. And then the third one was there. Oh, okay. Yep, great. Perfect. Very good.
Anne Gardiner. In the damage figures that you're showing, have they monetised anything to do with ecosystem ecodiversity loss?
Great. Simon.
Okay, I'll take them in reverse order. Some of the estimates monetize ecosystem losses, some don't. And although clearly the damage estimates from ecosystems are positive, in a sense there are damages, it's not necessarily the case that the damage estimates which include ecosystems are larger than the ones that don't, because there are other things that vary between these studies. So some do and some don't. The empirical studies that I introduced to you with that double-ended line, double-arrowed line, whatever you call it, interestingly, they don't include ecosystem damages and can, despite that, already be very large. And that's just based on how much the different economies seem to have reacted to temperature fluctuations in the recent past. Yeah, the Gilets jaunes, I mean, this is not, I suppose, my area of expertise. As I said, I wouldn't see I wouldn't see Macron's proposed increase in fuel taxes as being a particularly textbook example of carbon pricing, in the sense that it was narrowly imposed on a part of the economy which was probably already taxed to a large degree. I think that from a textbook point of view, carbon prices should be applied on a broad base. I think the EU emissions trading scheme, although it's had its difficulties, is a much better example of that, because it applies to a much larger share of the economy, and you don't see people getting stressed out about the EU emissions trading scheme. Research does suggest that in order for carbon taxation to be popular, it needs to be perceived to be equitable, which has important implications, I think, for how revenues are used. So I think that is an important conclusion. Now, as far as the risks of solar radiation management are concerned, I'm going to actually offer a humble and very short answer to this. I'm poorly briefed to come to you today on exactly what those risks are. So I'm just going to say, I'm afraid I can't tell you.
Well, that's commendable honesty, Simon. Thank you very much. There are people in the audience who can tell you, so mingle around, and the gentleman's here, John, those who know about solar radiation management. There are also people who can talk to you about dividends, carbon dividends, and one of them is right there. So maybe you two can connect later too. All right, next set of 3 questions. The gentleman in red, thank you.
Good evening. James Simmy, Oxford Brookes University. In the costs and benefits calculations for the poorer regions at 1.5, does that include the costs and benefits of forced mass migration?
Good question. And next one is one straight behind, immediately behind.
David Jai. This relates to the question about costing loss of diversity and the application of discount rates to such losses. And I think the fundamental thesis of using discount rates here has been attacked. I haven't got an alternative concept for how you would look at this, but and I don't know what's in the discount rate formula that you choose there, but would you like to comment on the use of discount rates and their calculation?
10 years on, it won't leave you alone. And there's just to finish on this side with the question there. It's a very good question on discounting, of course.
Hi, David Mercer. This question relates to your comments on carbon capture. I just wonder if you've got any views on energy return implications for these things. In particular, you're committing a greater proportion of your energy system to actually generate the energy. In particular, your comments to biofuels and energy return on investment, if you have any views on that.
Fantastic set of questions. All the chestnuts are emerging wonderfully well. So mass migration, discounting, and energy return on energy investment. And this side of the room, get ready. You're next.
Okay, mass migration is not explicitly included in any of the estimates. There is some thoughtful work emerging on trying to estimate or at least think about quantitatively think about what the response might be, but it hasn't yet found its way into the centre of the literature. And that's really all I've got to say about that, apart from firstly recognising the possibility, and secondly cautioning though that in my experience when it comes to these elements which are missing from the economic models, the obvious conclusion you come to is, oh, well, the models must be underestimating the cost. But what you have to appreciate is that in many of these models, what the economists do to make up for the risks they know are missing is try to come up with some guesstimate of how much are the missing costs. You can make the costs as large as you want them to be in these models, and some of them include very large guesstimates, so it doesn't necessarily follow that the numbers are underestimates. They're just more unreliable because of the things that they're missing. Discounting is an important issue which has been debated vigorously for decades, possibly most vigorously in the last decade as a result of the Stern Review. There are broadly 2 reasons to discount the future, one of which seems relatively safe for me and the other of which is more dubious. The safe reason for doing so is insofar as you expect the future to be richer, you would prefer to have money now, and therefore you should discount the future. Now clearly if the model says the future is not going to be richer, then you do the opposite. But insofar as you expect to grow and be richer in the future, you have more marginal utility, so to speak, from money today. And that's one reason for discounting. The other reason why economists traditionally have discounted is better understood as simply being impatience. The fact that even if we didn't expect to be any richer or poorer in the future, we would still prefer to have money now. For instance, because we're not sure we're going to be around in the future to enjoy it, or because we're just psychologically impatient. Now, on that issue, there is much more debate between economists, some of which, like Nick Stern and I, believe that you should look at this more as an ethical problem of fairness between generations, and on that basis there should be no such discounting purely for the passage of time. Others believe that you can still admit some discounting on that basis because, for instance, they believe in ideas of agent relative ethics or for other rather more convoluted arguments about society's implied savings rate being excessive otherwise. Carbon capture and storage and energy return, I mean, I don't have a lot to sort of say about that from an engineering point of view. From an economic point of view, I would think that that's one of the reasons why CCS is costly, right? Because it's not doing anything useful other than taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and holding it down.
Great, thank you. And we're going to start at the back on this side this time. So there's two next to each other, and then the gentleman just in front.
Hi, Simon. So I'm Sugandha. I'm a default student.
Be
My
nice.
question is, so 1.5 degrees doesn't pass your conventional cost-benefit analysis.
Or fail.
Pass or fail. But could a Rawlsian social welfare function help us here? And related to that, how much worse off are the poorest under 2 degrees versus 1.5?
Great, thank you. Rawls gets his airing. Yeah, next one.
Hi, my name's George Carey-James at the School of Geography. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about, you mentioned subsidies for low carbon technology and incentivizing the sort of dispersal of low carbon technology, whether you could talk about what you think is the best way to achieve that. Thank you.
Very good, yep.
Daniel Scharf, it's the annual reductions. I think you had a figure of 2%. That's a global figure? I assume that applies to both low carbon emitters and high carbon emitters. And would it be much harder for a United States or a UK to reduce? Because I've heard figures from the Committee on Climate Change and Tyndall Institute much higher than 2% annually.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Again, three good questions. So, Rawls innovation and the distribution of percentage reductions.
Yeah, okay. Rawls, yeah, that's a really good question. The framework that I presented to you, the simple formula for peak warming is based on utilitarian logic. It derives from a utilitarian social welfare functional. There have been some studies looking at so-called prioritarian social welfare functionals. They don't necessarily come up with unambiguous results, though, because, of course, when you go to a Rawlsian framework, it all depends on the balance of benefits and costs in the poorest country. And when you get down to that sort of lexical ordering, the results can be ambiguous. Policy on low-carbon technologies, I always find this, I should say, first of all, that this is not my sort of strong point, alongside the environmental risks of solar radiation management, evidently. But I always find this a bit of a messy area when I'm teaching my students, because there are lots of different policies that will do this, from R&D subsidies at the sort of early stage through to deployment policies like feed-in tariffs and renewables obligations at the deployment stage. I think it's an active area of debate where the right balance lies. It would seem to be, in some measure, both are required. I think my real message is that CCS, carbon capture and storage, seems to be the central issue here. And on that, the scale of support just needs to be so much greater. The level of coordination across countries seems to be so much greater. And we need to find a configuration of policies, whether it be mandatory CCS or just enormous subsidization of CCS, needs to be something that's going to work. Disaggregated rates of decarbonisation, yes, so that's a global average. And of course, how this is distributed across countries depends on the old thorny issue of burden sharing. But if you subscribe to the idea of common but differentiated responsibilities, which is in the UN Framework Convention and is implicitly in the UK's statutory targets, then naturally the rates of decarbonisation are larger for rich economies and in general, and they are lower for poor economies. So it's no surprise, and there's no inconsistency in comparing the result I showed you with work from the Committee on Climate Change suggesting that for the UK, with an already an 80% reduction mandated, looking at even higher, that it would have to be significantly higher.
Great. We're running low on time, but we'll have this quadrant. The gentleman there in kind of salmon has been very strident with his hand, and then in front there, thank you.
Leonardo Guita, DPhil student here in Oxford. There's, over the last few months, been increasing talk of a Green New Deal over in the States that tries to couple climate policy with, say, economic transformation. I'm wondering whether you have any thoughts on that, whether you think it's necessary, or whether you think it's maybe politically desired.
Excellent, thank you. Simon, you're getting the full spread here of very good questions. And last one.
Danny Dorling, School of Geography. I've seen cost-benefit analysis used very well for determining what drugs we prescribe and so on. But my question is, for very big things, I was never aware of it being used when we decided to reduce nuclear warheads by 90%. And I've seen it used in retrospect about slavery. But what is the biggest global problem to which cost-benefit analysis has actually been successfully applied before?
Very nice. Nice question, Danny. Complete with applause. There you go, Simon. Okay, a couple of minor ones for you to deal with.
Yeah.
The politics of the US and global CBA.
Okay. Green New Deal, I don't know. I haven't looked into it. I need to engage with it. I'm on sabbatical. I'm trying to enjoy myself. People I respect on Twitter have been a bit sniffy about it. That's all I'll be prepared to say. I'm going to mount a defense of cost-benefit analysis. I think my response would be in a sort of a series of points. First of all, I'm quite open to alternative frameworks for evaluating ex ante the benefits of policies. However, none of the main alternatives to cost-benefit analysis seem to be unambiguously better. I think many of the things that get economists tied in knots, like intergenerational equity, also have to be faced by other frameworks. I've spent quite a long time trying to engage with the idea of approaching climate change from a human rights point of view. I think that quite quickly that gets into situations of, well, this person's rights and that person's rights. I'm not sure that that gets you any clear answers either. So that's one point. And I'm aware of the well-known reductii ad absurdum about, for example, throwing Christians to the lions in the Colosseum and how that would have likely passed a cost-benefit test. And clearly in that case, you wouldn't have wanted to follow the recommendations. But I suppose I just finished because it's 6 o'clock. I don't think cost-benefit analysis is the problem here. I mean, even if you believe Bill Nordhaus that optimal warming of the planet eventually is 3.5 degrees, you have to also recognize that Bill is at the same time arguing that the optimal carbon price today is well in excess of $40, right? So if we could even just do that everywhere, we would be it would take a huge step towards where we need to be. So I guess I'm going to say, I don't think we're the problem.
Well, fantastic. I mean, I'm not sure about you, but I feel like this both elucidated some areas of confusion and possibly begged as many questions as it answered this session. There's obviously a lot more work to be done in this field, and Simon, we are grateful that you're one of the people doing that work. Now, before we thank you, let me just say this has been the penultimate lecture in a series on evolving economic thought. Next week, same time, same place at 5 o'clock, there's a lecture by Carl Benedict Frey on saving labor, automation and its enemies. So whether you're an enemy of automation or a proponent, do come and hear Carl. And we have a special event with the Rockefeller Foundation Economic Council on Planetary Health, entitled Chilling Prospects, How to Provide Cooling for All Without Blowing the World's Carbon Budget. That is also here on Monday the 4th at 5 p.m. with Dan Hamza-Gureka. So thank you for coming this evening, and please join me in thanking Simon for a fantastic session. Thank you.